Hey there, it's Andy from the Poor Proles Almanac. Before we get into this episode, I wanted to let you guys know about a new product our network sent along to us. Before you roll your eyes at us, we've never pitched a product on this show in 240 something episodes. Now, the reason why I'm willing to break that record is because I'm actually really happy with the product, which is Mando deodorant. I have very sensitive skin to the point that I basically stopped wearing deodorant because it always irritated my skin. Since I got a free trial from these guys, I figured I'd give it a shot. For the first time in my life, I have a daily deodorant that has no skin irritation. So if you're struggling to find one that doesn't bother your skin, I'm just telling you to give these guys a shot. They've got stick, spray, and cream deodorant, which I didn't even know was a thing, and they all seem to work pretty great. Now to get it, you can find them anywhere on social media at shop.mando, M-A-N-D-O, and you can get $5 off a starter pack with promo code Almanac, yes, Almanac, at mandopodcast.com/almanac. Welcome back to the Poor Proles Almanac. This is Andy, and today we're joined by Dr. Lauren Kepkiewicz. She's a community-based researcher and academic whose work explores the complexities of achieving just and equitable food systems. Her research, as we'll discuss, focuses on community campus engagement and building community organizations. A central theme running through her work is a critical examination of the power dynamics inherent in research and the need to disrupt traditional academic hierarchies that often prioritize Western knowledge systems over community-based systems. We talk about the concept of relational accountability and how those can guide research practices. Through the RARE Collective, which is composed of Indigenous and settler scholars, food providers, and community organizers, she focuses on deepening relationships to land and centering Indigenous women in two-spirit knowledges and experiences. We dive into the complexities of trying to build more equitable and sustainable food systems through community-engaged approaches. I think you guys will really enjoy this. Let us know what you think. Lauren, thanks so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background in academics and activism and how you got into this kind of unique food activism space?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back a little ways to when I was in my undergrad and I was studying international development and became fairly disillusioned with the idea of development as white folks going into the global south and doing development. And through that process, I wanted to think about how do we relate across difference and what is a useful lens or way of thinking about that? What is one way? And for me, food became that way. Food is a way to understand how do we relate across difference? How do we relate across geography? And how do we connect with one another in better ways? So I came to food in that way. I also grew up in rural Southern Ontario, so surrounded by agriculture and farms, although my family doesn't have an immediate history in farming, although we do have a few generations back history in dairy farming and vegetable farming in England and in Poland. I became really interested in the ways that food is understood and also how people were attempting to make change within food movements. And the idea of food sovereignty really resonated with me. And at the same time, I took a bit of time off from academia and I spent a season on an organic farm doing a free internship. It got me thinking about my own relationship to land and farmland in particular, and conversations around justice and activism that were happening in my farming community. And I noticed this was more than a decade ago. And I noticed that there weren't a lot of conversations about whose land were we farming on. And that seemed pretty messed up to me, particularly because, to farm, especially on a small scale, like you have this relationship with land, it's important, right? And so this question of, whose land am I farming on? What does my presence here mean? And how is that potentially also messed up? And that led me to thinking about how do we reproduce settler colonial narratives and practices within settler food movement spaces with the object of trying to come to ways to be in better relation with the land, but also how do we work across difference in relation to Indigenous and settler folks to create more sustainable, equitable, just anti-colonial food systems.
So you've been at it for a while.
I've been at it for a while, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you've seen quite a few things kind of come and go, especially around like the organic and the buy local movements and kind of how those intertwine with more radical positions like land back, which I think everyone understands are focused on the same general concepts, but tend to be two very different narratives. And that's one of the points you constantly make in your writing is that these two are not disparate subjects and we shouldn't be treating them as such. And the stakeholders in each of those conversations are very different. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things for me around food sovereignty is this idea that people and communities are the ones who should be able to determine what their food systems look like. That people and communities have a right to produce their own food in the ways that they want, that are culturally appropriate, and so on and so forth. But in a context like Canada, in a settler colonial context like Canada, I kept on coming across this tension, and I mean, this isn't just me. I'm learning from the people on a community level, on a community-based level. I'm learning from Indigenous teachers at the university. I'm learning from Indigenous-based community activists. So this is all, in some ways, this is not me talking as these are ideas that are my own. These are ideas that are that have learned in community and in activism. But one of the questions that came to me was this idea or this tension around, well, what does it mean for settler communities to determine what food systems look like on Indigenous lands? And what does it mean for particularly settler farmers and also settler communities more broadly? Of course, it's not just farmers. I have lots of farmer friends. I love farmers. But what does that mean when food sovereignty is used to stake claim to Indigenous land without attention to the ways that, first of all, settler agriculture has been used as a tool on these lands to colonize Indigenous land, that settler farms remain as ways to, or as barriers to prevent access to Indigenous people and nations from accessing hunting, gathering, fishing grounds. And what does it mean in a place, in different contexts? You know, in Canada, we see the food movement as heavily focused on local food as food that is grown, right? That carrots. And I mean, this is changing. It has been changing over the past couple of years, but I think this is it's still an entrenched idea that we're working to change, like that food systems aren't just agrarian, right? Certainly food systems are agrarian in lots of places, but that there are also food systems include hunting, fishing, gathering, and so on. And I'm trailing off on my train of thought here. So let me pause, and you can also offer a reset if that's helpful, because I'm getting
Sure.
I'm getting distracted by my own ramblings here.
I want to bring up a point that you made, that food systems are agrarian, but they're not just agrarian. They're framed in land access and relations to the land and to other people in community, which are these, if you think of it like as a stool, you've got the agrarian component's only 1/3 of that stool, right? Of those legs. The other two are the community and then the ecology for land access, and then the human component of how do frame the way we relate to food. If we think historically food systems are always based on landscape and the unique species that live there, the unique architecture of the ecology that frames up what is available for us to eat through the way we manage the landscape. And agrarian concepts kind of do that, but eliminate the other components of it. And what you're talking about is kind of reintegrating these other things within a historical foundation that is really to be blunt, messed up, and trying to come to terms with that. How do we do that?
Yeah. And I think part of my point is that local food systems are inherently context based and they look different. And in some places they're not agrarian, right? Like in the place that I'm currently in, like bison or buffalo were the keystone food species here, right? And that's not to say that there wasn't some food growing happening, but it's certainly, from my understanding and my learning, wasn't the primary food system here. And actually the introduction of cattle and obviously the overhunting of bison are both settler colonial processes that we don't necessarily consider top of mind when we are doing food systems work as settlers in food movement spaces. So I think one of my points is really, I think, to echo Indigenous activists and academics who have said, we're not just talking about agriculture here. There are other types of food systems. And certainly, like, there are also many Indigenous nations across the continent who were also agrarian, and you see, some of these narratives in food movements as well, talking about, like organic farming starting, but like in like the 1970s, and like, like
Mm,
it came from Europe, right?
yeah.
And you're like, okay, well, that also, like, people have been farming here in certain parts for like a really long time. Like, were they not doing organic agriculture? So my work really tries to tease out some of those tensions
Hmm.
and think about and question what we mean when we talk about food, and how we can use food as a way to think about how we relate, like how do I relate to this land? How do I relate to settler colonialism and so on?
And I think that's all really important because, to your point, if you don't have the historical context, you can try to do the right thing and actually do the very wrong thing. I don't even want to say wrong thing because that sounds binary, but I'm going to pick on some work that I respect very much, but I'm going to pick on it anyway. The Midwest is a really interesting landscape historically, and it's also become a very big hotbed for like agroforestry. However, framing a perennial food crop systems in a landscape that has traditionally been prairie lands isn't really, while it may be ecologically better than corn monocropped, when you divorce it from that historical context, you're not fully meeting the needs or fully respecting the landscape as it once was, and the real history that's been there, and the genocide and landscape destruction, and then just kind of like going over it with keyline agroforestry system is better, but it's not, you're not addressing that decolonial aspect of it when you don't contextualize it within this bigger historical narrative, if that makes sense.
Totally. And to go back to your previous question, which was a bit more specific around land access and land, I think one of the things about food sovereignty and food sovereignty movements, which is really important, is that there's this focus on land and access to land, and also land reform and land policy and private property and all this kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of narratives around how capitalism, financialization, these processes that are dispossessing farmers, small scale farmers, of their land and their ability to farm. This is framed as the primary land grab from some settler food sovereignty movements. And this is happening. This is real. And it's important to understand that this dispossession is happening and where it's coming from. But my work also asks, what other layers of dispossession have happened on this land, right? It's not small, medium scale, all kinds of scales of farmers who are struggling to have their livelihoods met. And it's not in any way to take away from that struggle that they're facing, but also to say there are other layers of dispossession. Indigenous peoples have been dispossessed from this land as a result of settlers inhabiting this land in many ways, part of that through agriculture, but also in many different ways, whether through private property, crown land, etc. Right? And so I think this is also something that I want to bring up. And there's not an answer to this, right? But I want to bring up some of these tensions in thinking about how do we move forward? How do we create more equitable food systems? We can't just think about the dispossession that's happened to small scale settler farmers. And it's not just settler farmers either, right? It's also Indigenous people also continue to farm and are affected by these broader processes of capitalism and so on. But if we want to be in good relation with the land and with one another, we have to go deeper than, what land dispossession that's happened since Canada became Canada, right?
Yeah.
And it's tricky, right? Because I understand they feel like thinking about and acknowledging these different forms of dispossession and land dispossession means that, I am implicated as a white settler person on this land. Of course, I'm implicated in the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. But that, I think, can be a starting point for thinking about new ways to be on the land, to create food systems. It doesn't have to be something that I have to feel like super defensive about and curl up in a ball, right?
Yeah. You have to shine a light on the creases that can hide some really nasty stuff to be able to move forward. And I think that can be a really difficult thing to do because on one side, you have folks that just will not acknowledge that it exists, or that if it did exist, like it's an ancient history. On the other side, it can be just seen as this kind of like self-defeating, small farmers are bad, big farmers are bad, everything is bad, and it feels very pessimistic and not offering any new opportunities to move forward, when in reality, it's like, well, once you get everything out, you can move forward. Once you air everything out, you open the windows, you let everything breathe. It allows you to start this process of figuring out okay, so now what? And I think that's something you started to address in some of your work with one group in particular, the Rare Collective, which we had spoken about before we started recording, which is really a really interesting concept. And you've taken this model in a couple different ways. But before we even get into that, I want you to ask if you could kind of describe what the Rare Collective is, if you can tell us what it stands for, and what your takeaways were from how this began to where you are today.
Yeah. And I think your point too, that it's important not to just have this be this whole like pessimistic thing of everybody is bad. And I think from my perspective, and I certainly have gotten some of that critique when I first proposed some of this work way back in my PhD, I did get some response that I was going to harm the movement. And I was actually surprised a little. I shouldn't have been surprised by it, but I was a little bit surprised because partly I was like, well, a lot of these questions are coming from the movement. Like these are conversations that I'm having. And I see like my aim with my work is to strengthen the movement, to say like, if we want to move forward, we need to move forward together, right? In a good way. And in order to move forward together, in order to move forward in better relation, we need to have some of these conversations and acknowledge and engage with what it means to be on this land in a settler colonial context. And so the RARE Collective stands for Relational Accountability for Indigenous Rematriation. And this project came out of multiple experiences. One of those experiences was an event in Southern Ontario that some of us, a few members of the collective, attended, that was led by an Indigenous woman. And she was trying to really dig deep into relations between Indigenous and settler farmers in the area and thinking about what it means as farmers to farm on Indigenous land, but also to be in better relation with neighboring Indigenous nations. We came away from that experience thinking that, wow, we need to have more of these conversations, in particular between farmers and Indigenous communities in the region, which obviously is different across the continent and across Canada. And so we came together, we're a collective of Indigenous and settler academics, activists, and farmers. And the original idea was that we'd have a series of encounters or gatherings between Indigenous and settler farmers and activists to talk about some of these tensions around land and farming, but also how do we work in good relation with one another. Of course, then COVID happened. So in-person events were not happening many. So we had to pivot and think about our work in different ways and also meet even amongst the collective. We were meeting all virtually like many other groups. And so really at the heart of this work is this idea of how do we be in good relationship? How are we accountable to one another? How do we build trust with one another? How do we bring care into the work that we do? How do we also think about working as a collective within academic institution that sometimes is not very friendly to some of these concepts of, like talking about relationships and feelings and that sort of thing. And then also, reaching outward outside the collective to learn from folks about, what does Indigenous land rematriation mean in different contexts? What does it look like in different contexts? And how do we support the work that's happening on the ground? And now I can't say that we've, come to conclusive answers to all of those questions, but those are some of the things that we were trying to think about and talk about within that work.
And how has it evolved since it began, or is it no longer really active? What's kind of the current status of it?
Yeah, so we ended up doing a podcast series actually about land rematriation and talking to a variety of different community activists as well as academics around what land rematriation looks like in their work and how that relates to food sovereignty. We also held what we called like a virtual encounter or gathering of both farmers and community-based activists, including both Indigenous and settler folks. The purpose of that was to build relationships, to have discussion. We wanted, I think, something more concrete to come out of that, but everything is evolving and fluid.
Mm.
We reached the end of our funding, I think, in this last spring. We have met as a collective several times. We're working on some writing right now, and yeah, we'll see where the future takes us. But definitely things have sort of been gearing down in terms of the work that we've been doing together over the past, goodness, like 6 years now, I think.
So with this organization, did you feel like your opinions and how you felt that you should engage with these conversations, did it change from having this consistent setting where maybe being in a more comfortable organization that you were with for 5 or 6 years allowed you to engage with this content in a new way that maybe allowed you to rethink some of your earlier positions?
Yeah, I think that any work that's based in relationships that happen over a span of years and over, several of us had, or at least two of us had multiple children, that those relationships always influence the work and the thinking. And I mean, I've learned so much from my time with the group.
I think I'm trying to think about this like from the perspective of somebody that's engaging with this kind of content for the first time. As a white person who may not have a lot of hands-on real experience discussing, this podcast, for example, my co-host was a Black man, and we grew up together. I was very used to not being in a room full of white kids, for example, and you can tell very quickly when someone has never been in that kind of a setting, they feel really uncomfortable. And I'm just curious, like having been in like these really difficult discussions with Indigenous folks about this type of stuff, and your comfort level develops. Is there kind of a moment where you can look back at who you were when you began and say you didn't understand this, or you did understand this and you were just afraid to engage with it? Does that make sense? I'm having a really hard time like articulating the exact question I want to ask, but I think I got kind of the emotive component to it.
Yeah. So thinking about, I guess, moving through feelings of discomfort a little bit.
Yeah, in this unique space, especially, and I'm going to make some assumptions about you, and I apologize if they're wrong. In more radical spaces where people can tend to be very focused on linguistic hierarchy and clarity and its own set of supposed rules around rightness. And I mean, it's in these types of spaces, it can be very insular and like esoteric. But now looking back at like when you have more comfort in that space, the things that maybe you look back and say, I didn't fully understand this, or I wish people just understood that XYZ. Did that help, or did that just make it more confusing?
No, I think probably for me, my experience in the Rare Collective has really been encouragement from a lot of my fellow colleagues to actually soften. And in part, I think before the Rare Collective was a thing, I think I had experience in a lot of those spaces that were a lot harder and more uncomfortable, which isn't to say that there was like we don't have uncomfortable conversations in the collective, but I think we're very focused on relationship building and trust building. And so that has allowed, when we do disagree or when we're like, actually, what you just said doesn't feel right to me. Like, I actually totally disagree with you. That has that we have created this space over time, and partly like there's not that many of us. I think, yeah, we're not a big group, but it's created this space where it's not like that we feel comfortable doing
Mm-hmm.
that, and it doesn't feel, I mean, nobody likes to be called out, right? But it
Yeah.
doesn't it's like, okay, this is actually the reason that I'm getting called out here, and maybe even called out is the wrong word because again, it's softer than that, but the reason that somebody's disagreeing with me or saying like maybe I need to rethink what I just said or whatever is because it's coming from a place of care.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a unique group setting that I think doesn't happen in a lot of in some other activist spaces, especially when they're like more expansive, when there's people kind of coming and going, when it's a bit bigger, like there's more people
Mm-hmm.
involved. So I would say, for me in the Rare Collective, I have greatly appreciated the care that my colleagues have provided. And also, like I've definitely been told to like, hey, Lauren, why don't you just like chill out? Like it's actually, you're taking this way too seriously and we're all good. And I think that this is something in the collective that we've really talked about in terms of pushing back against academia.
Mm-hmm.
As this collective has been a space where when we've needed, certain of us have like stepped back or stepped forward. I had my oldest child was just a baby when the collective started. He was at the first meeting, just a little baby. And I've had three more children since then. So I have had to step away,
Mm.
and that the trust is there. And I think that's not the case in a lot of other spaces that I've been in. So it's been a very, I think, quite a nurturing space for me, and a space that I have been encouraged to soften, and my critiques are always welcome, but that sometimes I don't need to always maybe I don't know, how am I saying this? I don't always need to make all the critiques that I'm making. And maybe that's not the way to say it, but that
Mm.
sometimes in our group it doesn't need to be I can let some of that go
Sure.
because we have this relationship of trust. Anyways, I
Yeah.
know that's not really getting at your question because I
No,
think
it is.
this experience is a bit different than a lot of other spaces I've been in.
I think that's really important, though. So when you're talking about like this type of a space, being able to engage in these really difficult conversations, the only way they're productive is if you have them without those landmines, right? Where you're not so cautious that you're incapable of engaging with like real emotion or feelings or thoughts, and instead are weighed down by academic jargon, the way a lot of left movements, progressive movements, activist movements tend to be so mealy mouthed in discussing anything that we can say radical things that mean absolutely nothing because we're incapable of creating the spaces to actualize them. And I think like what you're talking about, a collective where people can engage with these difficult conversations and then say, okay, now what? We have good faith in one another to move forward in some capacity. That is more valuable, in my opinion, than having like the right answers for how to fix things. Like nobody knows how to fix things, but if we can trust each other, we can probably figure out something like pretty good. It doesn't have to be perfect. It has to be like pretty good, right? And you can't do that if you don't trust one another, that if I say something wrong or this person is going to just use me for XYZ, for clout or whatever it might be. Without that mutual understanding and respect, there's no real potential for any like real radical revolutionary action and ability to apply any of these high, big picture, idea is that we envision the world as better, and it doesn't matter if we can't trust the people around us.
Yes, exactly. And I think part of one of the things that I've learned from my time with the collective and that I've been taught by my fellow collective members is also the role both of trust, but also of creativity in imagining alternative futures. And so we had a workshop last year out here in the Rocky Mountains. And one of the things that particularly Danielle and Taryn brought was encouraging us to get out of our heads, which as an academic, I like to be in my head a lot, to get out of our heads and really move that our ways of knowing and thinking about what we were doing to more artistic and creative expression. So we did art together, we had some skits, and I think that also builds on this idea of the role of creativity and fun and relationships in this work, which I can certainly get very serious about, right? But that if we're wanting to imagine these alternative futures, alternative food systems, whatever we're talking about, that we also need that creativity. That we can't do that without that creativity, right? And
Yeah.
that fun and that lightness as well as all the other things.
Yeah. Yeah. We are in totality of all of these things, not just one.
Yeah.
A couple years ago, we had, and we mentioned this, we were talking about this before the podcast, we had Brian Dale on, who wrote kind of a utopia-esque type description of food systems, and we had talked quite a bit about why that's important to do, because it's hard to advocate something if you can't point to, like, you can't talk abstractly. You have to be able to say, this is what I want, this is what things should look like, this is what it could look like. And that's powerful to be able to say, these are the things that we're fighting for, not abstract goals and lofty ideals, but things that are concrete and material and physical. And if you know what that looks like, you know what those steps to get there are like. And again, to my point earlier, we don't have to have the perfect answer. We just have to have a good enough answer. And to understand that it might not be what I want specifically, it might not be what you want specifically, might not be what someone else wants specifically, but you know what, it's close enough. And I trust the people around me to say, while it's not what I envision, I trust you guys that we'll make the best of whatever comes from this. And that's the component that really is missing. And that's something you actually got into a little bit. So could you talk a little bit about the CFS Hub and kind of what your takeaways were a little bit? Because I thought there's some really interesting stuff in there.
Okay, this is going back a little bit. So this is the Community Food Sovereignty Hub, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was part of a research project, this CFS Hub, or Community Food Sovereignty Hub, that was examining the relationships between communities and universities and thinking about how do we collaborate in meaningful and reciprocal ways across that university community divide, which is not all, it's a blurry divide in many ways as well. I mean, I learned a lot from this work. This work really informs my work today in thinking about how do I make my work accessible and relevant and meaningful, hopefully, to the communities that I'm working with, and how do I work in partnership with communities in reciprocal ways, because often academic research can be very extractive, can be
inaccessible,
not seen as very worthwhile. Yeah, inaccessible, etc. The ivory tower thing. So the CFS Hub was an attempt to better understand how we can work in better relation with one another.
Yeah. And one of the things that I found really interesting is the acknowledgement of how, I'm going to say ineffective because I think it's probably the best word that I can think of right now, how ineffective that cross-pollination from academia to the community can be. Not because what academics are doing isn't valuable, but because it's so disconnected in many ways from the real experiences that are lived by people in communities, especially in places that maybe are more diverse and the colleges are more monolithic, right? So like a private school in a poor rural community or a private school in a poor urban community, the overlaps are going to be very limited. And one of the examples that you guys brought up in the paper on this was about, you can grow food and then say we're going to teach people how to cook it, but that doesn't solve the problem of not having enough time in the day. If you're working 40 hours a week, you've got two kids and a parent you're taking care of. It's not about not knowing how to cook celery. It's about having the time, resources, and everything else to do it and making it a meaningful part of people's lives. That disconnect is really important. And I think, to what you're talking about with the Rare Collective, finding ways to actually make academic work meaningful and material outside of academia is far more important from an academic perspective than the actual research itself, in my opinion, is getting buy-in from people that what is being done is important. And that's something even in this podcast, I think sometimes when people are like, well, I just want to grow food. They're like, why do I have to care about all this other stuff? Why are you trying to tell me about history and like why white supremacy is tied to homesteading and all this other stuff? But it is important, and how to do that without talking down and without creating those real community connections is really valuable and something that's really underappreciated, I think, from an academic and from a radical perspective.
And to that point too, or closely related to that point, the way that we produce or create knowledge, in my opinion, matters just as much as the knowledge that we produce. Like they're inseparable, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is something that has really become apparent in lots of the research, including the CFS Hub, but also with the Rare Collective, this centrality of whose knowledge matters, whose knowledge is valued, and also how we even think about creating knowledge together, not just individually, and not just from our heads either, right? Like also from our hearts.
Yeah, or within the existing power structure of like the academics coming to tell you how you're living your life wrong, right?
Yeah.
And that's incredibly dangerous for reasons we can look at American politics to point to, where a dismissal of everyday knowledge has created a power vacuum around what knowledge even is.
Yeah, and you have to understand, or at least try to understand people's experiences, because otherwise, as you said, it doesn't matter what the knowledge is if it's not based in place and community. It's meaningless, or it's misguided, or it's harmful,
Mm. So I think with all of this, we have an answer on how to fix our food system, right? We've got it.
We've got it. Yeah, this is yeah. I know if there's one thing that I've learned from this work is there's no easy answers, and it looks different depending on who you are and where you are and what relationships you hold and what responsibilities you have to like the land and your community.
So what should we be thinking about and doing as consumers, backyard gardeners, and so on, that you think would be really helpful in trying to either like should people be trying to create something like the Rare Collective in their community, and if so, what does that look like? Or should they just be better neighbors, or just only buy from local farm? What are your thoughts about kind of what people should be doing in their everyday lives to try to make a meaningful material improvement in food sovereignty projects and so on?
Yeah, I mean, the answer that's always forefront is building relationships. And building relationships is going to look different depending on who you are, where you are. I know I already just said that, but relationships, I think, are key, right? And in some contexts, maybe it'll look like Rare, but in other contexts, it's going to look different. For me, food is one way that brings people together. I think it's an important way. I don't think it's the only way, but if I've learned anything about working across difference, whether it's across Indigenous settler differences or whether it's across, other differences related to like race or class, like bringing people together around food, showing care through food is often a really good place to start. Whether that means eating together, whether that means gardening together, whether that means being out on the land together, that's usually a good place to start. But it also has to go beyond that and thinking about how do we build trust? How do we build reciprocity? How do we, especially speaking as like a white settler person, like how do I think about decentering myself sometimes from some of the contexts and relationships that I enter into while also being true to myself and who I am. My gosh, I can't believe I just said true to myself. That's a good, but being
Authentic.
authentic. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just mansplain really quickly. It's fine.
Yeah. But I feel like, this is both relationships and relationality and accountability. Like this is where we need to be going, thinking about building community, thinking about working across difference, thinking about being uncomfortable. Like uncomfortable is okay. Like uncomfortable often means that you're like doing something important, right? And it doesn't mean we have to like just exist within discomfort. Of course not. We also have to exist within like care and feel cared for. But I feel like I'm getting really like existential here and not giving a clear answer. But I do think it's about building relationships, and people have different ways of doing that. And I think again, like based on trust, reciprocity, and not just thinking about relationships with people, although that's very important. And I think thinking about relationships across difference, but also with land and animals and plants, that all of those things are part of our communities.
I'd agree. Very well said. So is the Rare Collective something that is a public entity? I know you said it's kind of, I don't want to say over, but if people want to see more of what you're doing, they're interested in this type of work, is there any social media accounts, websites? I know you release academic papers. Do you have your own website or anything like that? Where can people that are curious about this kind of follow along?
Yeah, Rare has its own website. And so if you just Google Rare Collective, I should have the link here. We've got introductions to different members of our collective on there, and then a podcast series. So that's a good place to start, because it also we're trying to showcase other folks who are doing this, well, folks who are actually doing this amazing work. So that we do have an Instagram, but it's not it hasn't been active for a while. And yeah, we're I think right now we're in a writing stage. We're in a bit of a pause stage. We'll see what the future holds.
Oh, incubation stage.
An incubation stage. It's the winter. And then I am just transitioning to a new job, so I will likely have some of my own, hopefully a website up in the next year, but it's going to take a while. And in the meantime, you can also find me on
Blue Sky.
What is the website? Land.
Oh.
Oh, no, I'm not that fancy. You can find Rare online. We have a website. We do have an Instagram, but it hasn't been active for a while. On our website, you can find our podcast series, as well as Apple, Spotify, etc. And on that, we talk to a variety of different folks who are doing amazing work around land rematriation. So that's a great place to start. And like I said, there's so many people doing great work. So take a look at everyone who's been involved. And then I also have some of my work up at landfoodsovereignty.ca, so you can take a look at some of the things I've been doing and some of the other amazing folks doing work around food sovereignty in a Canadian context there. And there will be more to come. I just started a new job, so there'll be more to come.
Awesome. Lauren, this has been fantastic. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the conversation. So thank you, Andy. Yeah, I have to let my dog in.
Yeah.
I have to let my dog in. Sorry, she's like moaning in the background. She's very spoiled, and we don't like pretend to not indulge all her whims these days. She's very old, is what I should say. She's old and spoiled, so she just gets what she wants.